Excellent. So I hope this works out. I'm going to take you all through a timeline here, a long timeline, and tie this up in the end. So the title of the talk today is American or America on the Brink, Race, COVID-19, and More. So I'm going to take you back then to July 4th, 1776. And of course, we all know that the 4th of July holiday is coming up here. And this is when the Declaration of Independence, of course, was accepted, and it says, you can read it here for yourself or so. So I'd like you to kind of take in the words of the opening words of the Declaration of Independence. And then it goes on, of course, to give the causes for this separation. And the first paragraph reads as follows: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and so on. And you go on down the line here. And I want to draw your attention to the highlighted points in the highlighted points here. Truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator, certain unalienable rights. Amongst these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that when it's not working out with the government, and it says any form of government is destructive to those ends, then they have the right to alter or abolish that government and secure one that is better prepared to provide for their safety and their happiness. And then it gives reasons. Under what circumstances are you allowed to do this? And it says, when there is a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute tyranny, it in fact says it is their right and it is their duty to throw off such government. So these are the basic foundations of the United States of America, the basic founding principles, and I've kind of listed them in here, drawn out some of these points here again for you as well. So I want to just walk through the historical context, if you will, in which this takes place in global perspective. So as early of January of 1776, African Americans began officially serving in the Continental Army. This was indeed some 7 months before the Declaration of Independence. And you can see here the uniformed soldier who's from a Rhode Island regiment or so. And this then was not simply in the American context that you had soldiers serving, but indeed soldiers of color from what was then the colony of Saint-Domingue served in the American Revolutionary War with the French. And so they served, for example, at the Battle of Savannah. If you zero in on this, so on the drummer, this is actually depicting Henry Christophe, who of course goes on to become the first president and king of Haiti once revolution is secured there from France. So the global context, then, if we look larger at the global context and how, of course, the American Revolution influences the development of revolutions around the Atlantic world, most notably the French Revolution, which occurs in 1789. But the French Revolution is different from the American Revolution insofar as it comes along with the abolition of slavery. So the first French Revolution that occurs in 1789, a constitution is passed. They decide that they're simply not going to deal with the issue of slavery. That doesn't go over very well with the slaves in the French Caribbean colonies. And in Saint-Domingue, in August of 1791, there is a major slave revolt, and they simply burn up the sugarcane stores and cane fields and so on or so. And so that the first abolition of slavery, which occurs, is actually a self-abolition in 1793. But then beyond that, the French legislature, the convention, actually abolishes slavery in the French Empire on the whole in 1794 or so. So in 1794. And, you know, I want to just talk a little bit more about the context of in which this is taking place. And I had hoped to share some a number of images. But the context of the late 18th century is one where we have what scholars refer to as early modern globalization. And with early modern globalization, there came, in fact, a great deal of migration and also diversity across the Atlantic world. So there were any number of people of color who were in Europe or so. One of these, for example, was the Chevalier de St. George, who was one of the leading composers of the era. His father was French and his mother had been an African slave. He was his father's only son, and his father essentially sent him off to France for education, like various other French planters did. And he grew up in the French context, educated, and became one of the leading composers, and indeed was a tutor to Marie Antoinette. At the mid-century, Moritz von Saxe, who was known as Maurice de Saxe in the French context, became the head of the French army, and one of the first things he did was set up various battalions of color, so that there were Italian battalions full of people of African descent, as well as battalions of people of Turkish descent who were serving in the War of Austrian Succession. And the military then is one of those areas in which you saw tremendous social mobility of people of color in the mid-18th century. Over the course of the mid-18th century or so, and significant then advancement. So across Europe, and I'm just giving you the context of France, but across Europe, we can look to figures that are also in the German-speaking context. Angelo Solomon, who was at Vienna and who was a tutor or so. Any number of people that had gone to German universities and in fact had taken the highest degrees there, and in some instances teaching in German universities. In the Swedish context, there was often the case that not only in Sweden but elsewhere, but that there were a number of aristocratic families, indeed even kings and queens, that had adopted sons and daughters of African descent. And so they were in very high positions of power, intermarrying with the nobility and so on, as well as ordinary people. So for example, in the island of Saint-Domingue, on the eve of the French Revolution of 1789, the population of color, the free population was growing wealthier at a faster rate than the colon population on the island. So all of these things were at play, but I want to give you this context so that you see that what's happening in the American context, the Declaration of Independence, is not happening in a vacuum, absent of knowledge about the capacity and the ability of people of color, or so. So this occurs. And then on in 1802, Napoleon comes along and essentially seeks to reinstate slavery. And it's at that point where you have the Haitian Revolution. There is a very long war that takes place, and Haiti ultimately wins this war, defeating Napoleon and his army, the army sent to Saint-Domingue, and Haitian independence is declared in 1804. And the Haitian Declaration of Independence is really the second major declaration of independence that occurs after the American Declaration of Independence or so. Now, the United States, for the most part in this context, has pursued a policy of alteration instead of abolition. And I'm referring here again back to the Declaration of Independence or so. So in the context of what's happening globally, most of the northern states had in fact abolished slavery by 1804. All right, but across the United States, certainly in the South, slavery exists well on beyond its abolition, not simply once, but twice in the French context. So the French abolished slavery first in 1794, it's reinstated in 1802, but it is abolished again in 1848. Even the British had abolished slavery in 1833. So slavery exists decades in the United States, decades beyond when it had been abolished by the other great powers. So I want you to have this global context. And it takes a civil war, essentially, to abolish slavery. And of course, the Emancipation Proclamation is handed down or signed in 1863. And then after the Civil War, after 1865, the United States enters a period called Reconstruction. And it's in that era that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, and the first Civil Rights Act is passed, which guarantees freedmen the right to vote and right to full participation. So there is an era after the Civil War in which you have any number of people of African descent who were serving in Congress and across the various state legislative bodies. There's a significant growth of small business, the founding of educational institutions, and so on. So people basically lifting themselves up by their bootstraps in a nutshell, and demonstrating their worthiness to participate in the civil system, if you will. Well, that is all reversed, all right? And already underneath what is happening during Reconstruction, you have the rise of what's called Jim Crow. The slaughterhouse cases in 1873 began to chip away at the 14th Amendment. In fact, they pretty much almost nullify the 14th Amendment. In 1896, in the Plessy v. Ferguson case before the Supreme Court, this is when the notion of separate but equal comes into existence. But in fact, if you look at Plessy v. Ferguson, the court is considering whether states have the right to categorize people according to race at all. And there were these various different views across the states. And so the Supreme Court steps in to settle this, and it ultimately concludes, yes, the states have a right to, stamp people with a race, or so. So that also comes out of Plessy v. Ferguson. And at the same time, you have the development of state constitutions in the South, which effectively disenfranchise populations of color across the board. The Alabama Constitution is put into effect in 1901, which disenfranchises the great swaths of people of African descent. And already by 1913, there is a segregation of federal workplaces that takes place under the Woodrow Wilson administration or so. And all of this, of course, is held up by fear, right? By the terror of public lynchings and the Klan or so on. And within this dynamic of looking at public lynchings, one of the things that you often see is you see the role of the medical examiner or of these local coroners, oftentimes who had no experience whatsoever, no training whatsoever, and were simply elected officials or so. And so the coroners play a significant role actually in sanctioning these various lynchings. So you'll see an instance where someone is lynched and the coroner's report simply says, yes, it was something else. Oh, they drowned or something like that. All right, or so. Now I point this out because it's going to be significant down the line as I shift and I talk about the George Floyd matter or so. But I want to give you this sense of this evolution or so. Now, even while Jim Crow was growing, the United States has this sort of false image of itself, right? So here's a cartoon from 1902 which says false alarm, and the idea is, yes, it's around the 4th of July. There's this big ruckus. And Uncle Sam is saying to Lady Liberty, yes, it's just a false alarm. And he says, quote, "These are just my children." And his children are made up, if you can see this, I don't know if I can blow it up for you, but these are various states. So there's supposed to be someone who's from an Eskimo from Alaska, a Mexican from Texas, a person of color from Puerto Rico. Then you have North and South there, and New York and Massachusetts and so on. Out here, out towards the wall, you'll see Hawaii, and then the Philippines crawling over the wall or so. And so this is this false image of America as this melting pot. And these are just the children who are just, of course, playing together, celebrating the 4th of July. And all the while, Jim Crow was growing up, and there is tremendous segregation and discrimination, and public lynchings have become a regular reality in the United States. All right. So that order stays in place. The Jim Crow order stays in place until you get to the Civil Rights Movement, right? And what I want you to see about the Civil Rights Movement is this is in effect the second or third alteration, right? You've already had the era of the American Revolution itself, where there was clear examples of people living in liberty, and yet slavery was maintained, all right? There are a few alterations that take place at the state level or so. And then there is the second alteration that comes in the wake of the Civil War. And again, Reconstruction, and all of that progress is then reversed, right? The losses of property and land and so on, whole towns where people are pushed out of towns and their property had simply been taken from them, right? So that then comes along to the moment of the post-World War II era in the mid-50s, right? And the Civil Rights Movement, which is again, a third alteration, if you will. So in 1954, Brown v. the Board of Education essentially revives the 14th Amendment. I'm sure that you all are familiar with Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, where he in fact looked back to the Declaration of Independence and invoked the Declaration of Independence in his speech. From there is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But what I want you to see is the 1964 Civil Rights Act was not the first Civil Rights Act. There had been a previous Civil Rights Act or so. And then the 1965 Voting Rights Act. All right, so why is it then, if we sort of tie this up, why is it then that one can think of America or America's being on the brink in 2020? Well, what's going on here in the context of a global pandemic, in the context of stay-at-home orders, in the context of massive unemployment and an economy that, according to some accounts, is in worse shape than during the Great Depression, and all of this uncertainty. And then, of course, we may add to this the public knee lynching of George Floyd. All right, so what's going on? Why is there this massive discontent that you're seeing in the streets? It's because there is this longer roller coaster history or so. This isn't the first time. The post-60s environment isn't the first time that people of African descent and people of color generally have struggled up against some sort of backlash, right? And some sort of reversal of fortune. So when you think about things about disparate death and COVID-19, I'll just go back to tie this up in terms of what's going on here. Is this long roller coaster history. And again, there's disparate death in COVID-19, and there's clearly, obviously, the virus itself, but the disparity, the greater deaths amongst people of color is in fact a symptom of longer-term health inequality. It's part and parcel of a long train of abuses and usurpations, and part of this continuing legacy of an events designed to deprive people of color of their unalienable rights amongst these: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And on top of this, then you add something like the public knee lynching of George Floyd. And so when you think about these protests, and in my view, the exercise of their right, indeed their duty, to sort of throw off this kind of despotism, that doesn't mean you throw off the government writ large, but it certainly means a demand for the kind of alteration which I think you see in the streets at the moment. This comes in the context of a very long history, and we don't have to look at the entire history of slavery, all right, from colonial times. I think the more important history is, in fact, the history of the United States of America from the moment of the Declaration of Independence is signed. That is the moment, that is the measure, essentially, as to whether or not the country is living up to its promises. And again, I would call your attention back to that context of the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't a long history that they looked to. It was the history of the present king, where they looked and said, yes, there's an events design to deprive us of our unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so consider also the political context in which we are all functioning or so. And I think that gives you a sense of why there is so much anger and outrage on the street. This isn't the first time, right? This is not the first time. And so when you stop and consider that the reversal of fortune, which occurred at the early beginnings of the 20th century, right? That reversal of fortune was backed up by lynching, right? In this context, that gives you some context to why there is so much outrage, I believe, around George Floyd and the other cases that are coming out. And again, it looks and appears as if it's an events design. So I think there is some right then for people to protest in the streets, clearly. But I wanted to give you all that sense of long historical context as you sort of read the papers and think about what is happening in our world at the moment. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Margaret. We have Maria Paola Soto.
Mute myself. Okay, I wanted to know if you saw the fantastic documentary that I saw 2 days ago of Ava DuVernay 13, because he puts all this history in a context of economic decisions and the policy, and it's very, very interesting, and I didn't know anything about it. So thank you for your presentation.
Great, thank you.
So I have a more Personal question, Margaret. So how's the
Yes.
situation in Alabama?
Oh goodness, actually, interestingly, in this very small town of Millbrook, Alabama, believe it or not, there have been Black Lives Matters protests. People have been standing out with their signs saying Black Lives Matter, and even in that kind of a small rural locale, and it was a diverse crowd of people, frankly. So I actually think that it's wonderful sometimes to see the beauty in the brokenness, and I do think that we are a society that's just broken right now. But there's beauty in that brokenness, and I think the beauty comes in seeing the tremendous diversity of people who are who have come out to protest the blatant murder of George Floyd, and clearly it is pointing to others. I guess a note of caution would be that all of these movements have been diverse when you look historically, right? The abolitionist movement was highly diverse or so. Early on in the 18th century, as well as that appears in the 19th century or so. The civil rights movement arguably was highly diverse. I mean, Joan Baez sings the first song at the March on Washington in 1963. And there were very many different kinds of people. And if you look at some of those images, you'll see images that are not 100% dissimilar from the images we see today. There are people of Asian descent who appear, and people who are classified as white who appear, as well as people of African descent and Latino descent or so. So these movements were also diverse. So that's my note of caution here, is that yes, I think there's beauty in the brokenness and seeing the diversity, but as a historian, I can look back and say, well, there was always diversity. We have to wait to see how long this is going to be sustained.
Thank you, Margaret. We have a question from Denise Milstein.
Hi, thank you. And Margaret, thank you so much for your presentation. My question for you is, in light of what you've presented, what is the role, or what should be the role of scholars, scientists, social scientists studying the pandemic right now at the intersection of the mobilization that we're seeing and the history that we're aware of?
Oh goodness, I mean, that's a big question, and I can hardly define the role of my colleagues and what their focus should be. My sense is that COVID-19, that the virus is kind of one head of a many-headed hydra, right? And some of the heads were around before COVID-19, but there are others clearly emerging. And I think that in sort of looking at this, and thinking in a combined way of the environment of COVID-19 and the fact that even with a pandemic on, there was empathy on the part of this police officer, and his taking advantage of the environment was to knee lynch a Black man on a public street, even after he was being told clearly that he's dying, and Floyd there saying, "I cannot breathe," and screaming for his mother. We have a problem. So I think as social scientists, as historians, as scholars, I think you have to engage. I think that the day of, us sitting on the sidelines with our own little projects that interest us and not engaging this are over. I think very much the way that those who work in the physical sciences have been booted from their comfortable little holes and have to deal with finding a solution to COVID-19 and trying to find a cure. I think that we in the softer sciences, if you will, or in the arts and sciences, have to focus on looking at some of these other ills and really, really begin to think about how we can alter, how we can create alteration. Because if we don't have alteration, I think this society is in real, real trouble. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.